is not be afraid of these people no matter what psyop they throw at you. And I think this year, election year, not just in the US, but in much of the world, unprecedented fear-based psyops are going to be coming one after the other until they get enough people to comply and acquiesce.
While many people are told that Bitcoin is the key to escaping traditional financial systems, TradFi, and central control, the reality might be quite different. Prepare to forget everything you've ever known about Bitcoin, because the shocking truth may just change your mind. For example, a post from Cointelegraph in May revealed something pretty shocking. Two major mining companies control over 50% of Bitcoin's hash rate, meaning just two entities have an enormous amount of power over the network. And if you look at more recent data, the top 4 Bitcoin miners control over 77% of the network's hash rate. Doesn't sound too decentralized, does it?
In talking about this public-private play, it's important to keep in mind that what happens, just look at the Treasury Secretary office alone. So like in Clinton, it was Robert Rubin, Goldman Sachs. He helps repeal Glass-Steagall. And then when that whole bubble pops in 2008, Goldman Sachs' Henry Paulson is set Treasury of the Secretary. Then it's Tim Geithner, who worked under Larry Summers, and Robert Rubin is Treasury Secretary under Obama. And then it's Steve Mnuchin, who was involved in the 2008 financial crisis and whose dad was one of the top guys at Goldman Sachs, and he was also Goldman Sachs. So what they do when they're in power is that they create policies that help benefit them. They came from Goldman Sachs with intentions to implement policies that benefit Goldman Sachs, right? And so generally what happens is that when the private sector wants something, or they've created a big market for something, they've invested lots of money in creating something like the carbon market, and no one's using the carbon market, they are going to then use the public sector to force people to use the carbon market. And so they're trying to do that through the guise of climate emergency, right? And that's not working. So if that's not working, how will they go about and how will they do it?
She highlights how most people don't realize that a small number of players are gradually seizing control over Bitcoin and even Ethereum. In 2023, just 2 mining pools held 51% of Bitcoin's computational power. Meanwhile, Ethereum's situation isn't much better. By 2024, a few key entities like Lido, Coinbase, and Binance controlled the majority of its staking power. This level of concentration raises big concerns about market manipulation and centralization, which goes against the whole idea of cryptocurrencies being decentralized. But it doesn't stop there. Investigations from organizations like DARPA and analysis from Trail of Bits have dug even deeper, showing that these centralization issues aren't just about potential market manipulation. They could represent a larger systemic risk to the stability and integrity of these networks.
So Palantir was originally Total Information Awareness, and then they tried to rename it Terrorist Information Awareness, but Total Information Awareness is what they always wanted, and that's surveilling everyone for everything, and it's surveilling people at the biological level, like to stop pandemics before they start narrative. That was part of it. It was also about financial surveillance. It was surveilling what you buy at the grocery store. That is literally what they are doing again. But it's a mix of public entities and private entities that are all in these involved in these opaque partnerships. So it's not one clearly defined program at DARPA like it was originally supposed to be. But the goal is to completely erode privacy, to completely surveil everything, and prevent X before it happens. X being literally anything they don't want to happen or say they don't want to happen.
And it gets even more interesting. A report from the New York Federal Reserve in 2024 looked at how certain players on Ethereum's network are using arbitrage, exploiting price differences across markets, to maximize profits at the expense of smaller investors. This type of power consolidation, where key players benefit while retail investors lose out, seems to be in direct conflict with the supposed decentralized ideals of crypto. On top of all that, take a look at the data from September 2024, which shows that the top Bitcoin holders are overwhelmingly US-based companies, many tied to Wall Street. In fact, the US government itself controls around 2.5% of the Bitcoin supply, while financial giants like BlackRock and Fidelity hold significant amounts as well. BlackRock alone controls almost 3%, and it's also one of the biggest shareholders in MicroStrategy, another major Bitcoin holder. How they're doing it is as despicable as it gets.
Now they're back in the private sector. They make a bunch of money off of it. And then they come back into the public sector right before COVID. And Brian Brooks and Mnuchin kind of set up what they need, using government as this enabling environment to set up the blockchain carbon credit system. And then as soon as they're done and the Trump presidency is over and they've done what they needed to do, they leave and they go back to, the private sector, and they set up, these systems to take advantage of basically private capital creation.
So is Bitcoin really decentralized, or are we seeing power gradually shift into the hands of a few powerful institutions, including the US government? It's worth thinking about, because if these trends continue, we might be looking at a future where the promise of decentralization in crypto starts to look a lot like the centralized systems we thought we were leaving behind. The top 13 Bitcoin holders control about 4.4 million Bitcoin, or roughly 28.39% of the total supply. A large portion of that is tied to Satoshi Nakamoto's wallet, which we've speculated about for years. Many believe Satoshi wasn't just one person, but rather a group. And some even suggest this group could have ties to the government. Whether that's true or not remains a hot topic. There's a whole theory about how Satoshi Nakamoto is actually the CIA. There's a fun little rabbit hole for you to check out. On top of that, the growing influence of ETFs, exchange-traded funds, is worth noting. These funds keep gaining volume, and their impact on the crypto market is getting harder to ignore. Remember back in 2021, there was a thread on Twitter, now X, where Elon Musk was tagged? In response to it, he said, "Obnoxious threads like this make me want to go all in on Doge." Back then, Dogecoin was having its moment, but Musk also pointed out something critical about Bitcoin. He mentioned that Bitcoin was already highly centralized, with a supermajority controlled by a few large mining companies. And even now, that's still the case. In fact, he gave an example of how a flood in a single coal mine in China back then caused Bitcoin's hash rate to drop by 35%, showing how centralized and vulnerable the network was.
So if you won't do it because you're like, oh yeah, this is a way I'm going to use JP Morgan coin and beat the Fed CBDC, if you're not going to get suckered into that, then it seems like they'll use destabilization and desperation as a way to get people to onboard into the systems that they're creating. They're not just going to spend billions of dollars.
While Chinese miners had significant control over Bitcoin at that time, things have shifted. Now, a majority of Bitcoin mining is done by US-based companies, with 77% of the network controlled by just 4 major players. That's a staggering level of concentration for something that's supposed to be decentralized. Just think about it yourself. What is the next step for all of these financial institutions? What gives them control over all the money in the world? Digitalizing physical money, turning it into something they can surveil. That's the end game.
William Barr, Attorney General under Trump, legalized pre-crime in the United States. It will come. They've set it up, and they want it all to run on your data. They want to prevent, they'll say it's for terrorist attacks, it's for pandemics, it's for crisis X, Y, and Z, it's for climate calamity. We have to prevent it before it happens. It's all algorithmic based, but they can only manufacture consent for that if there's a climate of fear.
This brings us to Whitney Webb's insights, which we'll explore through a podcast clip from episode 499 of TFTC. In one clip, Whitney addresses how the government and big corporations are playing a more significant role in Bitcoin than many realize. She highlights how, over the years, key figures from Wall Street, especially those tied to Goldman Sachs, have used their positions in government to create policies that benefit their own interests. These same institutions are now deeply involved in shaping the future of Bitcoin and the broader crypto market. One key point she makes is about the public-private play. When private companies invest heavily in a new system, like programmable money, they often use their influence in the public sector to push people toward adopting it. For example, they may push policies that force people into using these new systems, whether they're interested or not. This could be similar to what's happening in Argentina, where economic desperation is pushing people to adopt things like WorldCoin, which involves scanning your eyes for a digital ID.
Like Mark and I have discussed before, they're trying to go about it the private sector route. Oh, okay, you guys aren't interested in programmable, surveillable money if it's emitted by the central bank. So if it's emitted by a private bank, maybe you will, right? But the other side of this is what's happening in places like Argentina right now, where people have lost so much of their purchasing power. So like before Milei came to power, I think the poverty rate was it was insanely high. I think it was something like 60%. And then Milei came into power and devalued the currency by 50%, which led to a massive loss in purchasing power for Argentinians on top of that.
Whitney suggests that this growing control over financial systems, including Bitcoin, is part of a larger plan.
Sort of like 2008. Oh, look, the private banks have destroyed the economy. Now we need the public sector to come in and rein them in, even though Obama's cabinet that was supposed to be doing that was literally chosen by Citigroup, right? They're the ones that are going to come in and they're going to rein these in, and these are the policies and changes that need to be made. But actually, it's the bankers that wrote the changes that need to be made, right? So we're likely going to get set up for something like that, where they're going to try and make like existing money worthless. And if you want your money to be worth anything and maintain any sort of semblance of purchasing power, you have to use financial products X, Y, and Z. And they're all going to be programmable and surveillable, if not by the private sector, by the public sector.
If people don't voluntarily adopt systems like programmable money from central banks, they might be pushed into it by private companies. And if that doesn't work, economic crises or desperation might force people into these systems, with Bitcoin being a key part of this larger strategy. The idea seems to be keeping Bitcoin around as a way to store assets, but not allowing it to become a widely used currency, keeping the power firmly in the hands of a few. And believe it or not, it gets even more interesting because Jeffrey Epstein also once talked about Bitcoin, saying it wasn't meant to be a currency, but rather a tool for asset storage. This aligns with what big players like Larry Fink are pushing for. They don't want Bitcoin to function as everyday money. They want it to be a tool they can control.
There are going to be all these different wallets and digital ID systems that look like they're different companies, but they're all the same, essentially, in terms that they can export all their data to the same central global database.
Many Bitcoin-focused media outlets don't talk about this because there's been a concerted effort to control the narrative. Major money and influence have been poured into making Bitcoin holders compliant with this vision. Figures like Larry Fink and his Wall Street peers want Bitcoin to serve their interests, while much of the Bitcoin community is distracted by the rising price or following talking points that make them content with their gains. In the Bitcoin space, there's been a shift away from the original ethos of challenging the central banks and government control. Instead, figures like Michael Saylor and other Bitcoin influencers are more focused on financial gains and embracing the involvement of Wall Street.
There's another very prominent Bitcoiner that likes to run with that line.
So, yeah. So
Michael Saylor is basically it's property. It's not currency.
Yeah.
Yeah, funny that. Didn't the chief of staff of InQtel come from MicroStrategy? That's interesting. Anyway,
Sure did. With Pautos. Yep, sure did.
Yep. So, anyway, basically, if Bitcoin is kept in that box that people like Larry Fink and Jeffrey Epstein and people like them, Larry Summers, presumably, who was on the Zappo advisory board, these guys want Bitcoin to be a specific thing because they can use it. And there's people in the space, like this RSK guy, saying Bitcoin needs to lose its revolutionary ethos. It's got to drop that and become a tool for Wall Street.
For example, some prominent Bitcoin advocates were celebrating the US government's purchase of Bitcoin at events like the Bitcoin Conference. And there was even hype around Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s claim that if elected, he would sign an executive order for the US to buy 550 Bitcoin a day. But this celebration of institutional involvement raises concerns. Bitcoin was originally created as a decentralized currency free from government control, but now with entities like BlackRock launching Bitcoin ETFs, the very idea of Bitcoin is being reshaped. Bitcoin maxis, those who still hold on to the original dream of Bitcoin's decentralization, are now faced with a different reality. Today's Bitcoin is more about profit and media clicks than resisting centralized control. In fact, Whitney Webb argues that this shift is by design. There's an effort to make Bitcoin users compliant with this new Wall Street-driven direction for Bitcoin, and the media discourse around Bitcoin is being carefully controlled to ensure that people don't question it. The Bitcoin we see today is very different from its original vision in 2009, and unless people start pushing back, it risks becoming a tool for the very institutions it was meant to challenge. As major corporations like BlackRock file for Bitcoin ETFs, it's becoming clear that Bitcoin's future might be controlled by big business. BlackRock already owns massive shares in countless industries, so it's no surprise they're positioning themselves to dominate Bitcoin as well. In fact, some argue they already do. If you look at the big mining companies and Wall Street's involvement, it's clear Bitcoin is increasingly falling under corporate control.
There's a lot of people in the Bitcoin media space that will never talk about this or what you just mentioned. And I think a lot of that is because a lot of money and effort has been put into specifically homogenizing media discourse in the Bitcoin space, because they want Bitcoiners as much as possible to be compliant, while Larry Fink and his ilk do what they want with Bitcoin and make it what they want it to be, so that people are content with number go up and sort of the Saylor-esque talking points that have gotten a lot of,
Whitney Webb highlights how these ETFs are allowing companies like BlackRock and Fidelity to quietly seize Bitcoin by amassing large portions of it. These corporations are not here to benefit the average investor. They're motivated by profit and control. As ETFs grow, so does their influence over the crypto space, leaving less room for retail investors. Right now, Wall Street controls over 8% of Bitcoin, but what happens when they control a quarter or even half? The endgame, as Whitney Webb suggests, is all about control. These corporations want to manipulate the Bitcoin market, and the narrative that Bitcoin is still decentralized and safe for individuals is starting to crack. Influential figures like Michael Saylor and other Bitcoin maxis continue to push the idea that Bitcoin is property, but property can be seized, unlike currency. This raises the concern that Bitcoin could be taken from owners if it's categorized as property.
I mean, that's the mentality there. And I feel like the Saylor mentality really isn't that different from that. We have to push people in the other direction, because if we go in the direction they're pushing those, people to go in, people that want to drop the ethos or whatever and make Bitcoin just a tool for Wall Street. No. If we let that happen, very bad things happen, and there has to be a fight. And there's a specific effort that's been launched against people that hold Bitcoin to try and get them to be compliant in that sense. And that's through, controlling the discourse in the media space.
And don't be fooled into thinking this is impossible. There are already measures being put in place to achieve this. Initiatives like Operation Choke Point 2.0 show how they can restrict access to crypto, tightening their grip over the market. The real problem, as Whitney Webb points out, is that some in the Bitcoin community, driven by greed, are embracing this shift toward corporate control. Figures like Max Kaiser, one of Bitcoin's early advocates, now seem more focused on hype and short-term profits, fueling a system that contradicts Bitcoin's original purpose.
It's the trap, and a lot of it is the media discourse. And I think, the more controlled online discourse becomes, the greater the effort will be to use it to get people to be very afraid of what's happening. Yeah. And if you unplug a little bit and spend more time in the actual world, you are much less likely to feel that way. And I think that's why during COVID, they wanted so much of our discourse to be online. And then they took even greater control of the online discourse. And we know now, under the guise of election censorship, they're going to clamp down even more on online discourse and lead it in very particular directions. They want Americans in particular to be at each other's throats. Textbook divide and conquer, among other things, though. I mean, they have this whole war on domestic terror apparatus, all this stuff about civil war, and we need this and that. Regular Americans are generally on the same side, and they want to divide everyone, and it's all through fear. And they've been doing this psyop after psyop after psyop, whether it's 9/11, COVID, you name it. I mean, it's all fear-based.
In short, Bitcoin's decentralization is under threat, and the push toward ETF dominance is turning it into a tool for Wall Street, not the people. If this continues, we could witness a future where Bitcoin is no longer the independent asset it was designed to be. How do you think this all pans out? Let us know in the comments below.